back to another episode of The Roundtable. I'm your host, Gus Poulos, and joining me today are my three co-hosts,
Chandler Flowers,
George Columbiris,
and last but not least, Adam Alali.
Thank you guys so much for being here today. We have an exciting episode today with a lot of interesting topics. We are going to be getting into transgender athletes. Now, we've all seen the news recently. We've all heard the stories. Transgender athletes in these athletic competitions are becoming a very mainstream issue. And today we're going to talk about why that is and maybe some potential solutions to this issue. But to start, we're going to ask Chandler, our resident expert on transgender athletes. Chandler, what is this debate surrounding transgender athletes really about?
Sports are all about providing a fair and inclusive opportunities for all athletes, and that's what the main debate now is: fairness versus inclusivity. Now, you can't really have one without the other, but the problem right now is that they are on both conflicting sides. So the mainstream media is pitting fairness, so like women, cisgender women athletes, against inclusivity, which is against the transgender athletes. So as the fight for the LGBT rights has grown global at this point, this debate over their involvement in sports, primarily in the women's category, has gained lots of traction in mainstream media, both good and bad. With athletes like Laura Hubbard, the powerlifter, Leah Thomas, the swimmer, and the track stars Andrea and Terry taking women's categories by storm almost, this debate has struck up controversy basically everywhere.
So you're saying the key to this issue is to promote fairness and inclusivity, but since the current sports world does not have this, the debate will continue to escalate?
Yes, exactly. Because these two are pitted against each other, it's almost like there is no win right now.
So our listeners are probably wondering, what's the purpose of this podcast? Why are we discussing this issue today?
So the purpose of our podcast is to create an outlet for our viewers. We want to share our views on this pressing issue, and this topic is important, so it should be talked about frequently.
George, who's actually benefiting and being affected by the participation of transgender athletes in athletics?
The people being affected by the transgenders in athletics are the competition, the cisgender athletes who compete against these transgender athletes, the children who watch these athletes who get ideas of hope that they can be confident in their own skin when they participate, the parents of the cisgender and transgender athletes who go through media sources seeing their children get bashed and beaten by the competition verbally and in the pool. And that's mainly it.
Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other stakeholders and individuals involved?
The stakeholders involved in the NCAA are the governing body. They're in charge of the rules and regulations in the NCAA, and they have a lot of power with creating these rules that allow and don't allow transgender athletes to participate in athletics.
Can you tell me some of the viewpoints of these stakeholders and why they might be different against one another?
These stakeholders have a lot of power in their position, and a lot of people look at them like the deciding factor for these rules. And when they make decisions based on their own beliefs that might go against the views of transgender athletes and their supporters, they're seen as transphobic and hate trans people. So it's a hard topic.
So now that we kind of understand who is being primarily affected by this issue, what do we think the general public are saying about this issue?
Well, I can actually answer that for you, Chandler. So recently, in May 2021, there was a poll done by Gallup where about 60% of Americans believe that transgender athletes should only be allowed to participate in the division which their birth gender identifies with. So, if you're born as a male, you should only be able to compete with the males, right? So that's what most people believe, and that number has only gone up since then. In May 2023, they performed the same survey, and the numbers have only gone up. It's up to 70% now. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, most people don't believe that transgender athletes should be able to compete in the division that they want to compete in.
Well, the general public aren't really the only ones that are participating in sports. So for the people actually being affected, how do cisgender women actually feel about the participation of transgender athletes competing in their division?
Well, Chandler, as George mentioned earlier, a lot of people are just scared to, say how they feel because they're afraid of, being labeled as these haters and homophobic and stuff like that. But there's been a few people that have come out and put out their word about this. The most notable one probably is Riley Gaines. She competed against Leah Thomas in 2022, and she came out about the unfairness that she had to face against Leah Thomas. How much of a advantage that Leah Thomas had over her, as well as some concerns about being in the locker room with her, since she has male body parts. It might be a little bit uncomfortable for these people.
We have discussed why we're doing this podcast, both sides of the debate, and the importance of inclusivity and fairness in sports. With that being said, where do we go from here?
Well, currently the main governing bodies behind rules regarding transgender athletes in competition are the NCAA, which we've discussed already, and the International Olympic Committee. And both of these governing bodies are essentially just readjusting their rules every couple of years to promote more transgender inclusion in their sports. And while eventually I do think this could solve the issue or relieve some of the tension that's felt on both sides, I don't think it will solve the issue completely unless fairness and inclusivity are at the forefront of these rule-changing decisions. Now, one interesting thing that we as a group have come up with is to create open divisions within sports. Now, an open division would allow anyone who wants to compete the chance to compete. So you have the issue of inclusivity already addressed, and open divisions would address fairness by selecting competitions based on skill level instead of by gender. Because currently all the major sports we see in the world are segregated by gender. It's always the men's division and the women's division, and that's why we're seeing so much trouble with transgender athletes competing, people arguing on both sides. But if we just had open divisions, then athletes can compete based solely on their skill level and not based on their gender.
From what I can tell from what you just said, Gus, it sounds like the Premier League is kind of embodying that same system. It uses regulation and promotion as a way to almost punish the teams. The teams that don't do as well get relegated, and the teams that do well, they get promoted to a higher league where there's might be higher competition, more funding, and more people will watch. If this system is applied to individual athletic competitions, then the supposed unfair advantage of transgender athletes would be mitigated.
That's exactly right, George. The whole purpose of these open divisions would be to create athletic competitions based solely on skill level and no other factors.
Well, guys, we've given you a lot of information today. We've discussed a lot of serious topics, including transgender athletes, and we just want you to, go out and discuss this with your friends, your family, and, just approach issues like this with an open mind.
We would like to thank our listeners for joining us on another episode of The Roundtable. Join in next week when we will have some even more exciting topics to talk about. Thank you all.